Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
The city that forgot it was alive. The rusted iron of the railway bridge vibrated under Bain McGregor's boots as a massive ore freighter slid through the Duluth shipping canal 40 feet below. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The wind coming off Lake Superior carried a bitter, wet chill that forced the few sailors visible on the ship's deck to hunch into their heavy jackets. Bain stood completely still. He had been in the exact same spot for 40 minutes, without shifting his weight or shoving his hands into his pockets. He did not feel the cold. He never felt the cold. It was one of 100 small, daily reminders that he did not belong to the world of the living, even if he walked among them. When the freighter's massive hull blocked out the shore lights, the water turned into a black mirror. Bain looked down and caught his own reflection. For a fraction of a second, his pupils dilated and his eyes flashed a distinct, amber-gold color in the darkness. He looked away immediately, gripping the rusted railing until the metal groaned under his palms. He hated seeing it. He knew exactly what he was, and he did not need the reminder. He had chosen Duluth 14 months ago for one specific reason. The massive iron ore deposits buried deep within the bedrock of the region acted as a natural shield, scrambling the delicate sensory navigation that full-blooded vampires used to track prey and communicate. Vampires avoided the city entirely. The ambient magnetic interference gave them severe migraines and left them disoriented. Because they did not nest here, Bain could actually close his eyes at night. Yet he still hated the place. He hated the endless gray horizon of the lake, the permanent scent of wet rust, and the fact that 14 months was the longest he had stayed in a single town since he ran away from his last foster home at 16. To maintain the illusion of a normal life, Bain worked the night shift doing security at the Duluth Entertainment Convention Center. The job was simple and suited his nature perfectly. He spent 8 hours walking through empty, cavernous exhibition halls or standing in the pitch-black corners of loading docks, watching the few human beings who stayed up late. Around 4 in the morning, the heavy fire door at the end of the main corridor creaked open. Dorothy Reed, the night supervisor, limped into the room. She was 58 years old, possessed a no-nonsense attitude born from decades of working low-wage security jobs, and suffered from severe arthritis in both knees. In her right hand, she carried a paper tray holding 2 steaming styrofoam cups. "You're standing in the dark again, McGregor," Dorothy said, her voice raspy from a lifetime of smoking. She held out one of the cups toward him. "Black 2 sugars. Just how you like it." Bain stepped out of the shadows. His digestive system did not process human food well, and the caffeine did absolutely nothing for his heart rate, but he took the cup anyway. Dorothy was the closest thing he had to a friend, and he refused to give her a reason to look at him with suspicion. "Thanks, Dorothy," Bain said, keeping his voice flat and even. He took a small, careful sip of the hot liquid. "Quiet night out there." "Too quiet. This town feels like a graveyard that forgot to bury itself," Dorothy grunted, leaning her weight against a concrete pillar to relieve the pressure on her joints. "You look tired, kid. You always look like you're carrying the weight of the world on those shoulders." "I sleep fine," Bain lied smoothly. He waited until she looked down at her clipboard before he quietly emptied the rest of his coffee into a nearby floor drain. When his shift ended at 6, Bain walked back to his apartment, a cramped one-bedroom unit located above a failing laundromat on the edge of town. The space was completely devoid of personal touches. There were no books, no television, and no comfortable furniture. The only notable feature of the apartment was the western wall, which was entirely covered by a massive, highly detailed topographical hunting map of the upper Midwest. The map was a chaotic web of obsession. Dozens of red strings stretched between pins, connecting police reports, missing person flyers, dated train schedules, and grainy photographs. At the dead center of the map hung a single, faded photograph. The image showed a tall man standing outside a Chicago train station in the late 1990s. The man shared Bain's sharp jawline and broad build, but his expression was entirely different. His eyes were cold, predatory, and completely empty of human empathy. It was his father. Bain had never discovered the man's real name. On the back of the photo, he had scratched a single word into the paper with a pocket knife. Nothing. Giving the monster a name felt like giving him an identity he didn't deserve. Bain sat on the edge of his bare mattress and looked at the photo. He viewed his own existence clinically, without an ounce of self-pity. If a police officer were writing a report on Bain's life, it would read exactly how Bain thought about it. His mother had been a 20-year-old college student. His father was a predator who hunted her. The pregnancy was a medical impossibility that should have ended both of their lives, but Bain survived. The birth tore his mother apart from the inside out, causing her to bleed to death on the delivery table. His father had walked out of the hospital doors before the doctors could even declare the time of death, disappearing into the night without looking back. That abandonment left Bain to grow up in a broken foster care system. He was a dampier, a half-human, half-vampire anomaly. He possessed the strengths of his father's bloodline without the fatal weaknesses. He could walk in the bright afternoon sun without burning. He didn't need to sleep in a coffin filled with his native soil. He had a functioning heartbeat, though it thudded at a slow, heavy 40 beats per minute. When he was injured, his flesh knit back together much faster than a human's, but the process was painful and took hours rather than seconds. The real problem was the hunger. His body required fresh blood to survive. It wasn't the desperate, maddening thirst that drove full vampires to slaughter entire families, but it was a constant, dull ache in the back of his throat. It felt like a severe chronic illness that required a strict medication schedule. Throughout his teenage years, the hunger had caused terrifying accidents in his foster homes. He had been bounced from town to town, labeled as a violent sociopath, until he finally grew old enough to understand what he was and developed a strict system to harvest blood without killing his sources. The system was dangerous, expensive, and deeply degrading, but it kept him from becoming the monster he hunted. Now, his entire life was reduced to a single objective: tracking down the man who made him. He hunted the vampires who ran the urban undergrounds, and he targeted the human sycophants who fed those vampires, torturing them until they gave him a new piece of the puzzle. He wanted to look his father in the eyes right before he drove a silver spike through his heart. A sharp vibration broke the silence of the room. Bain reached into his pocket and pulled out a cheap, prepaid burner phone. The screen displayed an unlisted number. He flipped the phone open and pressed it to his ear without speaking. "Bain, you there?" a frantic, breathless voice whispered on the other end. It was Russell Brooks, a 44-year-old information broker based out of Minneapolis. Russell was a pathetic creature who managed illegal gambling dens for the vampire syndicates. He sweated constantly through his cheap suits, jumped at his own shadow, and traded secrets to Bain in exchange for his life. "I'm here, Russell," Bain said, his voice dropping an octave. "What do you have?" "I found something real this time, I swear to God," Russell stammered, the sound of heavy traffic audible in the background. "A courier came through the interstate transit hub an hour ago." He was carrying an encrypted ledger with a list of old safe houses from the late 90s. One of the names tied to a property in northern Wisconsin matches the description of the guy you're looking for. The cold one. The one who doesn't use a sire name. Bain's grip tightened on the plastic casing of the burner phone until it began to hairline fracture. For 3 years, he had been following dead ends and cold trails. This was the first concrete lead that connected directly to his father's old network. "Where are you right now?" Bain demanded. "The truck stop off Highway 53, just south of the city limits," Russell said, his teeth clicking together from sheer panic. "You gotta get here now, Bain," If the local enforcers figure out I copied these files, they'll skin me alive. Hurry up. The line went dead. Bain slowly closed the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. His muscles tensed, urging him to sprint out the door and sprint down the highway. But he forced himself to breathe. Impatience got hunters killed. He walked back to the window and looked out across the gray expanse of Duluth one last time. Down on the canal, the tail lights of the ore freighter were finally disappearing into the early morning mist. Bain turned around, grabbed his heavy canvas jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out into the dark. The worst of both worlds. The neon sign for the 24-hour diner on Superior Street hummed with a low, irritating buzz that vibrated straight through Bain's jawbone. Inside, the air smelled of stale grease, burnt coffee, and old bleach. Russell Brooks sat in a corner booth, his hands trembling as he gripped his third cup of black coffee. A thick film of greasy sweat coated his forehead, making his thinning hair stick to his scalp in wet strands. He looked like a man who had not experienced a full night of sleep since 2019. Bain slid into the vinyl booth opposite him, his movements completely silent. Before he could even look at the man, the smell of Russell's raw, chemical fear triggered something dark in the back of Bain's mind. The scent of terrified human sweat always sharpened his thirst, dragging up memories he spent every waking hour trying to suppress. Images from his past tore through his consciousness like jagged glass, brief, brutal memory fragments he could never quite scrub away. He remembered being 6 years old in his very first foster home. The Campbells had been good people, the kind who kept a clean house and bought him new canvas shoes for school. But one night, the dull, throbbing ache in Bain's jaw grew too intense to ignore. His gums burned, and his saliva tasted like salt. Driven by an instinct he couldn't name, he crawled into the bed of another foster child, a 7-year-old boy named Toby, and bit his shoulder. He hadn't broken the skin, but he had clamped down hard enough to leave a deep, purple bruise shaped like a small jaw. Toby's screams had woken the entire house. Bain hadn't understood what he was doing, or why the phantom copper taste in his mouth felt so necessary. The agency removed him within a week. As the social worker led him to the car, Bain looked back and saw the Campbells standing on their porch. They looked profoundly relieved, and deeply ashamed of being relieved. By age 9, during his third placement, he had learned to control the urge to bite people. Instead, the hunger manifested as a desperate craving for raw flesh. His foster mother, Patricia Morris, woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning to a strange scraping noise in the kitchen. She found Bain crouched on the cold linoleum floor in front of the open refrigerator, his small hands covered in blood as he tore a pound of raw ground beef apart with his teeth, swallowing it clotted and cold. Patricia didn't scream at him, she screamed at the sheer sight of him. When Bain looked up, his face smeared with grease, and his eyes flashing a bright, predatory gold in the ambient bulb light of the fridge, the horror on her face solidified his understanding of his own monstrosity. He was packed into a social worker's van the next morning, before the sun had even cleared the trees. At 12, a cruel, suspicious foster father named Gerald Watson noticed that Bain never got sunburned, even after spending 14 hours outside clearing brush in the midsummer heat. Gerald grew obsessed with proving the boy was defective. He decided to test him on a blistering August afternoon when the heat index hit 100 degrees. He forced Bain to stand in the dead center of the barren backyard for 2 hours without a hat, shade, or water. Bain stood there perfectly still, his skin remaining cool, dry, and pale while Gerald watched from the porch, sweating through his shirt. When Gerald started telling the neighbors and the caseworkers that the boy wasn't human and didn't sweat like a Christian, nobody believed him, labeling the man an abusive lunatic. The state moved Bain anyway to avoid the liability of Gerald's escalating erratic behavior. When he was 14, he ended up in a crowded, underfunded group home in Duluth. An older boy named Brandon Hughes, a 17-year-old juvenile offender who targeted the smaller kids for money and clothes, cornered Bain in the dark basement laundry room. Bain had ignored the taunts and the stolen meals for weeks, but when Brandon shoved him against a concrete pillar and pulled a rusty pocket knife, Bain's instincts took over. He grabbed Brandon's wrist and squeezed. He hadn't meant to use his full strength, but the sickening crack of 3 of Brandon's fingers snapping like dry twigs echoed clearly over the hum of the washing machines. Brandon dropped to his knees, vomiting from the pain, and later told the staff that Bain had attacked him unprovoked. Bain didn't even bother to argue or mention the knife. He just waited in the office for the next transit car. The last placement had been Linda Taylor when he was 16. She was a widow who lived on a small farm, and she was the only one who genuinely tried to understand him. She looked past his cold demeanor and saw a hurting kid, teaching him how to fix engines and baking him bread. For nearly a year, Bain was meticulously careful, checking his eyes in the mirror every hour. But then puberty hit, and the vampire blood inside him surged with a violent, unpredictable thirst that animal meat could no longer satisfy. One night, after staring at the pulse in Linda's throat while she taught him how to balance a checkbook, Bain realized he could no longer guarantee her safety. He packed his single duffel bag and left through the window in the middle of the night. He left a scrap of paper on the kitchen table that said only, "Sorry." He had thought about Linda Taylor almost every single week since, wondering if she thought he was dead or just ungrateful. "Bain, are you listening to me?" Russell's panicked whisper snapped Bain back to the diner booth. Bain blinked, his amber eyes settling on the plate of scrambled eggs and cold toast the waitress had just dropped on the table. He picked up a fork and began eating the food he didn't need, chewing slowly, solely to look normal. "I'm listening, Russell." "Speak." "I intercepted a comms packet between 2 vampire operatives running the Minneapolis transit routes," Russell said, leaning across the table, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and anxiety. "They aren't moving drugs or weapons this time. It's a shipment of people. Humans. They're trafficking them in from the Dakotas to serve as a live blood supply for a growing vampire collective in the Twin Cities. It's a slaughterhouse pipeline." Bain kept chewing, his expression a mask of stone, but his hand froze slightly over his plate. "That's not all," Russell continued, wiping his sweaty palms on his cheap polyester trousers. "The whole operation is being organized by someone the regional syndicates are calling the architect." Bain went completely still. He set his fork down with a tiny, sharp clink against the ceramic plate. The air in the booth suddenly felt heavy, the temperature seeming to drop. Russell noticed the shift, swallowing hard and instinctively pulling his chair back a few inches. The architect was a ghost Bain had been hunting for 2 years. This particular vampire didn't just slaughter people in dark alleys. He built complex human networks. He used willing human collaborators, well-paid informants, and trafficked victims to establish secure logistics pipelines that supported vampire operations without drawing the attention of federal law enforcement. Bain had no definitive proof, but 3 pieces of circumstantial evidence and a deep, gnawing gut certainty told him that the architect was the man who had abandoned him in that hospital 26 years ago. "Give me a name," Bain said. "Joseph Rivera," Russell whispered, sliding a folded piece of lined paper across the sticky table. "He's 30th. A human logistics coordinator for a regional shipping firm. He's the one routing the unmarked transport vans through the state check stops. He has an apartment across the river in Superior, Wisconsin. It's 20 minutes over the bridge." Bain took the paper and shoved it into his jacket pocket. He reached into his leather wallet, pulled out a $50 bill, and dropped it on the table. The meal cost less than 15, but Bain always tipped excessively. It was a leftover human instinct, a desperate way to maintain a shred of personal decency in a life defined by violence. "Get out of the city, Russell," Bain said quietly as he stood up. "If they find out you leaked this, I won't be here to protect you." Bain walked out into the pre-dawn chill, and got into his 2009 Chevy Impala. The engine turned over with a rough, heavy rattle that shook the steering wheel. The car was a piece of junk, but Bain knew how to maintain mechanical parts through sheer stubborn will alone. He shifted into drive and headed south toward the Blatnick Bridge. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the Impala was parked in the shadows across the street from a drab, concrete apartment complex in Superior, Wisconsin. The cold air inside the car didn't bother him. Bain leaned back against the headrest, his eyes locked onto a single, lit window on the third floor. The light hadn't flickered or gone off all night. Joseph Rivera was awake, and Bain was just waiting for the streetlights to turn off. A system that works until it doesn't. The dashboard clock in the Impala flipped to 5:12 a.m. Bain sat motionless in the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Across the street, the third-floor window of Joseph Rivera's apartment remained bright, a sharp square of yellow cutting through the thick morning mist. Bain didn't move toward the building yet. He couldn't. His body was signaling a dangerous drop in reserves, a physical reality that required him to slow his breathing and calculate his limits before entering a hostile environment. He did not kill. That was the absolute, unyielding line he had drawn in the dirt for himself years ago. He had crossed it exactly once, when he was 19. A man in an alley in Minneapolis had cornered him, pulled a switchblade, and demanded his wallet. Bain had reacted on pure instinct, his half-vampire reflexes taking over before his human mind could intervene. The man's throat was crushed, and he was dead on the wet pavement before Bain even realized what his hands had done. Bain didn't run. He sat on a rusted dumpster next to the body for 2 hours in the dark, watching the blood pool in the gravel. He didn't count that night as a murder, but he had never forgiven himself for it either. The horror of how easily the life had left that man forced Bain to construct a strict, 3-part system to manage his existence. His first and most reliable source was Samuel Cook, a 61-year-old hospital administrator at a regional clinic in Duluth. Samuel was a cynical, quiet man who was months away from retirement and had spent decades looking the other way for the right price. He regularly skimmed expired whole blood bags destined for the hospital incinerator and slipped them into a cooler in the back of his station wagon. Samuel didn't know what Bain was, nor did he want to know. He assumed Bain suffered from a severe, unlisted genetic blood disorder that required off-the-books transfusions. Bain paid him $3,000 in cash every month, and Samuel never asked a single question. This supply covered roughly 60% of Bain's monthly baseline. His second source was entirely legal, though deeply ironic to Bain. He regularly registered for clinical medical trials and paid research studies at universities across the Midwest. Because his heart rate was slow and his immune system was aggressively efficient, his blood was undoubtedly medically fascinating, though he always left before the researchers could dive too deeply into his anomalies. The small stipends he earned from these studies helped fund his payments to Samuel and kept gas in the Impala. The third source was the one that kept Bain awake at night, with a sour taste of shame in his mouth. When the expired medical supply ran short, which inevitably happened during periods of extreme physical exertion or high stress, Bain had to find a human being. He selected them with terrifying care. They were always adults, always alone, and always in places where they wouldn't be missed for an hour. He would stalk them into a quiet corner, pin them quickly, and take just enough to quiet the burning in his veins. He never took enough to cause medical harm, faintness, or anemia. Once he had what he needed, he used a mild form of vampiric compulsion, the only inherited psychological trait from his father that he could reliably control, to cloud their minds. He would look into their eyes and force them to forget the entire encounter, replacing the memory with a sudden dizzy spell or a momentary lapse in concentration. He told himself this was a clean, non-monstrous compromise. Some nights when the guilt was particularly heavy, He almost believed his own lie. The blood need was not a simple hunger. It didn't start in the stomach. It began as a heavy, throbbing pressure directly behind his eye sockets. As the hours passed without sustenance, his worldview literally began to narrow, his peripheral vision darkening until it felt like he was looking through a telescope. Colors drained from the environment, leaving the world looking flat and charcoal gray. Sounds became muffled and distant, as if he were underwater. Most dangerously, the amber gold color in his eyes would expand outwards from his pupils, slowly swallowing the natural brown of his irises until there was nothing left but a pair of glowing, predatory discs. When the need reached that critical stage, Bain became a liability to everyone around him, driven entirely by a biological imperative to feed. Right now, he was 4 days behind his schedule. Samuel's latest delivery was late due to an administrative audit at the clinic, and Bain was running on nothing but fumes. The pressure behind his eyes was a dull, constant knife prick. He opened the car door and stepped out into the superior dampness anyway. If he waited for a fresh delivery, the lead on Joseph Rivera would go completely cold, and the traffic pipeline would move another shipment of victims into the Twin Cities. Bain slipped into the apartment complex through a side fire door that hadn't latched properly. He took the concrete stairs to the 3rd floor, his heavy boots making absolutely no sound against the stone. Outside apartment 3B, he paused to listen. He heard the low, rhythmic breathing of a single occupant. Bain pulled a small set of professional tension wrenches from his inner jacket pocket. He inserted them into the deadbolt. His sensitive fingers felt the tumblers drop one by one. The lock clicked open in less than 10 seconds. He slid inside and closed the door behind him without a sound. The apartment smelled of old pizza boxes and sour laundry. In the living room, Joseph Rivera was sprawled asleep on a fake leather couch. A heavy, expensive laptop sat open on his stomach, its screen illuminating his sleeping face with a pale blue light. Bain stepped closer, his eyes adjusting instantly to the glow. On the screen was a massive encrypted spreadsheet detailing transport routes, vehicle identification numbers, and a list of names with corresponding weights and age brackets. At the top of the document was a delivery address for a commercial warehouse in North Minneapolis. Bain pulled out his burner phone, keeping the flash off, and methodically photographed every line of data on the screen. His hands were steady, but the golden rim around his pupils flared slightly as he looked at the human logistics of the slaughterhouse pipeline. A sudden floorboard creak from behind broke the silence. Rivera hadn't been asleep on the couch all night. He had just drifted off after returning from the bathroom. He opened his eyes, blinking against the blue light of the screen, and found himself staring directly at a towering stranger standing over his laptop. Rivera's eyes went wide. He didn't scream. He scrambled backward off the couch, knocking the laptop to the floor with a loud plastic clatter, and lunged toward a half-open kitchen drawer 5 feet away. Bain knew exactly what was in that drawer. Bain was faster. He was always faster, even when running on empty. Before Rivera's fingers could even touch the metal handle of the drawer, Bain's left hand shot out like a piston, catching Rivera by the throat and slamming him violently against the drywall. The plaster cracked under the impact. Rivera's legs dangled 6 inches off the floor, his hands frantically clawing at Bain's forearm, which felt like a solid bar of iron. "Don't reach for the gun, Joseph," Bain said. His voice wasn't raised. It was flat, cold, and entirely devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Rivera gasped for air, his face rapidly turning a dark purple as he stared into Bain's eyes. Up close, the amber color was clearly visible, shifting like liquid gold under the dim kitchen light. Who are you?" Rivera choked out. "The syndicates. They'll kill you for this." Bain lowered him just enough so Rivera's toes touched the linoleum, but he didn't slacken his grip on the man's windpipe. "The architect," Bain said, leaning in until Rivera could smell the cold, metallic scent of his skin. "Tell me how to find him." Rivera's entire body went limp with a sudden, paralyzing terror. The mention of the name seemed to drain the remaining fight out of him. "I don't know," he sobbed, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. "I swear to God I don't know. He doesn't meet with people like me. I'm just a logistics coordinator. Everything is compartmentalized. The vampires who pay me, the ones in the Twin Cities, they've never even seen him. We only get encrypted text files and routing orders through a secure server. Nobody sees the architect. Nobody." Bain stared at him for 5 long seconds, watching the micro-tremors in Rivera's eyelids. The man was telling the truth. He was too low on the food chain to have ever looked the monster in the face. "Give me the names of the enforcers who collect the manifests from you," Bain commanded. Rivera shook violently, his voice cracking as he blurted out 2 names and 2 phone numbers associated with a salvage yard incident. "Paul." Bain memorized them instantly. Once the data was secure, Bain raised his right hand and forced Rivera to look directly into his eyes. "Look at me," Bain whispered. The amber color in Bain's eyes expanded violently, completely filling the sockets with a dull, metallic gold glow. Rivera's frantic struggling stopped instantly. His jaw went slack, his arms dropped to his sides, and his pupils dilated until his eyes looked like empty black wells. The compulsion took hold, wrapping around Rivera's conscious mind like a heavy, wet blanket. "You fell asleep on the couch," Bain told him, his voice droning with a rhythmic weight. "You had a bad dream about a break-in. You remember nothing else. You will wake up in 10 minutes with a headache, shut your laptop, and go to bed. Do you understand?" "I understand," Rivera mumbled, his voice distant and hollow. Bain slowly released his grip, letting Rivera slide gently down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his eyes staring blankly into space. Bain turned and walked out of the apartment, closing the door softly behind him. By the time he reached the gravel parking lot, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. A cold sweat broke out across his neck. Using the compulsion while his body was already depleted was the equivalent of running an engine without oil. The mental effort had burned through his remaining physical reserves entirely. The world around him was completely gray now, the sound of the distant highway muffled as if his ears were packed with cotton. He stumbled to the Impala, unlocked the door with fumbling fingers, and popped the trunk. Inside, hidden beneath a spare tire and a jack, was a small, insulated plastic cooler. Bain tore it open, grabbed one of the emergency bags of expired blood Samuel had provided 3 weeks ago, and ripped the plastic port open with his teeth. He climbed into the front seat, slouched down below the window line, and drank. The blood was cold, thick, and tasted faintly of plastic and chemical preservative. It was stale, dead fuel, but it was medicine. He forced himself to swallow every drop, squeezing the bag flat until it was entirely empty. Almost immediately, the pressure behind his eyes began to ease. The flat gray of the parking lot sharpened back into its natural, ugly colors. The tremors in his fingers slowed and finally stopped. Bain leaned his head back against the vinyl seat, closing his eyes as his heart gave a few slow, heavy thuds against his ribs. He didn't start the car for 20 minutes. When he finally shifted into drive, he turned the Impala back north, crossing the bridge into Duluth. He drove straight to his apartment, locked the triple deadbolts on the door, pulled the shades tight against the coming morning sun, and didn't speak a single word to another living soul for 2 days. Everyone in this world is after something. The gray morning light had barely broken through the Duluth mist when Bain stepped out of the laundromat's side exit. A worn canvas duffel bag hung over his left shoulder, packed with a few tools and the remaining blood bags from Samuel's late delivery. The Chevrolet Impala sat parked in its usual spot at the curb, but the space was no longer empty. A woman leaned against the front passenger fender, her arms crossed over a dark tactical jacket. Victoria Sanders was 34 years old, compact, and perfectly still. Her posture carried the distinct weight of someone who spent her life dealing with extreme violence and had grown entirely bored by it. She didn't flinch when Bain appeared, nor did she reach for the weapon clearly concealed beneath her armpit. Her eyes, a sharp and steady blue, locked onto his face. "Bain McGregor," Victoria said, her voice cutting clearly through the quiet street. "You're a hard man to track down when you don't want to be found." Bain stopped 5 feet away, his muscles instantly tightening into a defensive crouch. The air around her didn't carry the dead, sweet scent of a vampire, but she wasn't a normal civilian either. "Who are you?" "My name is Victoria. I represent an organization called the Covenant," she replied, straightening up from the car fender. "For a little over a century, my people have been managing the vampire population in the upper Midwest. We don't expose them, Bain. We contain them. Public knowledge of monsters causes mass panic, and panic causes chaos. Chaos is infinitely harder to control than a few dozen leeches." A cold sensation settled in Bain's stomach as she spoke. The realization that an entire group had been watching him without his knowledge was a dangerous failure on his part. "We have a file on you that goes back to that group home incident when you were 14, Victoria continued, tossing a manila folder onto the hood of the Impala. "We know what your father is. We know what your mother was. And we know you've been tearing up the regional logistics lines looking for a ghost." "Get away from my car," Bain said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. His amber eyes flared behind his eyelids, the intrusion into his hidden life hitting him like a physical blow. "The collective in Minneapolis is growing too large for one person to handle," Victoria said, ignoring the threat in his tone. "They are trafficking humans across state lines. The Covenant wants to offer you a partnership. Your unique physical access and abilities, combined with our heavy weapons, safe houses, and deep intelligence networks. We can help you end this." "No," Bain said immediately. The answer was flat and final. He didn't trust organizations, and he certainly didn't trust humans who made a habit of managing monsters. Victoria didn't waste breath arguing. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a heavy cream-colored business card with a single phone number printed across the center, and dropped it on top of the manila file. "The offer stands, McGregor. You're going to hit a wall in Minneapolis, and when you do, call that number." Bain watched her walk down the cracked sidewalk toward a black SUV parked at the corner. Her stride was rhythmic and balanced, the movement of a fighter who had survived 100 ugly rooms and won nearly all of them. He memorized her gait, filed the license plate of the SUV into his memory, and threw the folder and the card into his passenger seat before starting the rusted engine. The drive south on Interstate 35 took nearly 3 hours. Minneapolis was larger, noisier, and darker in the specific, suffocating way cities became when something massive was feeding on the population from the inside out. A normal traveler wouldn't notice the signs, but Bain's mixed blood made him hypersensitive to the rot. He saw the clusters of missing persons posters stapled to telephone poles in the lower-income districts. He noticed the complete absence of stray dogs and feral cats within a 6-block radius of certain industrial sectors. He saw the exhausted, gray blankness on the faces of the pedestrians walking the sidewalks near the river, the look of a community that was being bled dry so slowly they thought the fatigue was just a normal part of living. Finding the commercial warehouse from Rivera's spreadsheet required another 12 hours of careful surveillance. The building sat on a desolate gravel lot near the rail yards, its corrugated steel walls stained with rust and soot. During the daylight hours, 3 human guards in grease-stained coveralls patrolled the perimeter, their hands resting near their pockets. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. 3 full-blooded vampires arrived in a tinted delivery van, rotating through the building's upper offices with the casual arrogance of apex predators. Bain crouched behind a pile of discarded railroad ties half a block away. He focused his hearing, straining past the ambient roar of the nearby highway. Deep within the center of the warehouse, a sound caught his attention. Heartbeats. Multiple human hearts, fluttering with the rapid, terrified rhythm of caged animals. The original objective of his trip had been to find a direct line to his father, but the wet, thudding sound of those hearts changed things. He could not drive away from a building where human beings were being stored like cattle in a meat locker. Bain pulled the cream-colored card from his pocket and dialed the number. Victoria picked up before the first ring finished. "I'm standing outside the warehouse on 14th Avenue, Bain said without introducing himself. "There are 11 people inside. 3 leeches. 3 human guards. You have exactly 40 minutes to get your people here before I kick the front door off its hinges alone." He hung up without waiting for a reply. 38 minutes later, the black SUV slid into the alley behind the railroad ties. Victoria stepped out, followed by 2 other operatives. Timothy Foster, 29, carried a heavy tactical case and radiated a frantic, nervous energy that made him constantly adjust his glasses. Carol Hayes, 52, was a former military medic with graying hair pulled back into a severe bun. She carried a massive trauma kit and a short-barreled shotgun with a practiced, casual grip. "Timothy is jamming the local cellular band so they can't call for reinforcements," Victoria whispered, checking the chamber of her silenced pistol. "Carol and I will handle the humans. The parasites are yours, McGregor." The breach was not a cinematic affair. It was an explosion of raw, pragmatic violence. Bain led the charge, his heavy boots splintering the wooden side door into kindling. The 3 human guards in the main office didn't even have time to raise their weapons before Victoria and Carol were on them, slamming them to the concrete floor and securing their wrists with heavy zip ties. The vampires in the back storage bay reacted with supernatural speed. The largest of the 3, a pale creature with yellow teeth and a jaw that unhinged slightly, lunged from the top of a shipping container. Bain moved in a way that defied human biology. He didn't dodge. He absorbed the impact, his dense bones taking the force of the collision as they crashed into a concrete pillar. No words were exchanged. No dramatic speeches were made. Bain grabbed the vampire by its throat with his left hand, his fingers sinking deep into the dead flesh, while his right hand drove a heavy steel rebar spiked directly through the creature's sternum. The vampire convulsed once, its body instantly turning into a gray, crumbling ash that coated Bain's boots. The remaining 2 parasites were faster than the first. One caught Bain from behind, kicking him with enough force to send him flying across the room. His body smashed into a heavy steel shelving unit, which collapsed under his weight, burying him beneath hundreds of pounds of rusted automotive parts. Pain flared through Bain's ribs as the metal gouged his chest, but his accelerated healing kept him conscious. He threw the heavy shelves off his body and rose to his feet, just as Victoria fired a specialized incendiary round into the chest of the second vampire, lighting the dark room with a blinding white flash. The third creature turned to flee toward the loading dock, but Bain intercepted it, his amber eyes glowing with full, terrifying intensity in the darkness. He tackled the creature into the gravel outside, using his body weight to pin its arms before driving a second spike through its throat. The warehouse fell completely silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. Inside the back storage cage, 11 human victims sat huddled together on filthy mattresses, their eyes wide with horror. Carol Hayes immediately moved past Bain, cracking open her medical kit to begin the triage process with cool, military efficiency. Bain left the victims to the Covenant and walked back into the small, glass-walled manager's office. His chest was bleeding through his torn shirt, the deep gashes already beginning to itch as the half-vampire cells fought to close the skin. He ignored the discomfort and began tearing through the desk drawers until his fingers wrapped around a cheap burner phone. The device was unlocked. Only one contact was saved in the memory, labeled simply as 1. Bain opened the single text thread. The last message had been sent 6 hours ago. The shipment is delayed at the Wisconsin border. Clean the facility and wait for the routing adjustment. Do not make mistakes. Bain read the words 3 times, his breath freezing in his throat. The language was cold, perfectly structured, and completely clinical. He had never heard his father's voice, yet the specific rhythm of the sentences matched the cold, empty expression in that old photograph on his apartment wall. A heavy, dark weight settled behind his ribs. He knew this voice. "What did you find in there, Bain?" Victoria asked, stepping into the office doorway. Her jacket was smeared with black ash, her eyes tracking the movement of his hands. Bain slowly slipped the phone into his inner pocket, his face turning back into an unreadable mask of stone. "Nothing useful," he said, walking past her without making eye contact. "Just logistics." Victoria didn't reach for her weapon, nor did her operatives try to block the exit. She simply watched him walk out into the cold Minneapolis night, letting him go because she knew the trail he was following would eventually bring him right back to her door. You can inherit things from people who never touched you. A grueling 14-hour journey back to Duluth offered nothing but time to think, the kind of heavy, circular thinking that poisoned a man's head. Rain lashed the cracked windshield of the Impala as the vehicle crawled north along the interstate, the tires throwing up twin sheets of gray spray against the concrete barriers. The rhythmic, mechanical thud of the wipers matched the steady, unnaturally slow beat of a genetically compromised heart. The burner phone from the Minneapolis warehouse sat on the passenger seat, a silent, black piece of plastic that held a predator's clinical language. Piecing together the fragments of an absent parent's existence had consumed the better part of a decade. This obsession was documented in police reports, ancient property deeds, and stolen medical logs stored inside a battered green trunk beneath the apartment mattress. The target went by the name of Malcolm. Surnames became irrelevant to vampires who survived long enough, cast aside like useless human clothing that no longer fit. Based on historical data, local folklore, and behavioral patterns gathered from terrified survivors over the years, this entity was likely between 200 and 400 years old. The local timeline was highly specific. Malcolm had arrived in Duluth in the late 1990s, blending into the community with the practiced ease of an apex predator, masquerading as a wealthy timber investor. A chance encounter at a downtown cafe had led him to Sharon McGregor. The 24-year-old nursing student was remembered by an old college roommate as kind, overly trusting, and possessed of a loud, genuine laugh that filled any room she entered. The relationship endured for 4 months before she became pregnant with a medical impossibility. Whether the poor girl ever realized her lover was a monster remained an agonizing mystery that haunted every quiet hour of her son's life. Labor proved fatal for Sharon. The delivery room became a slaughterhouse as the child's unnatural, dense biology tore her apart from the inside out, causing a massive hemorrhage that the doctors couldn't stop. A cold, unnamed male signed none of the admission paperwork, spoke to no one in the waiting room, and vanished from the hospital corridors before the morning sun broke over Lake Superior. A blurry photograph remained the only physical proof of the man's features. Obtained at age 21 through a black market information broker who charged a year's savings, the image showed a tall figure standing near a Chicago transit hub. The resemblance was terrifying. Looking at the photograph was like staring at a reflection from which every shred of human empathy had been surgically removed, leaving only a cold, efficient shell designed for hunting. Labeling the emotion toward this creature as hatred was an oversimplification. The feeling was a toxic mixture of rage, a desperate question that would never receive an answer, and deep grief for a mother who died for a monster's fleeting amusement. Beneath the anger lay a profound, nameless dread that the vampire blood in Bain's veins would eventually swallow his humanity entirely, turning him into the very thing he spent his nights destroying. Safely back inside the Bear apartment, 3 days dissolved into a blur of intense analysis. The text thread from the warehouse phone was cross-referenced with every known communication pattern associated with Malcolm's old networks, Bain tracking the specific punctuation and vocabulary until his eyes were bloodshot. A sudden call from Russell Brooks broke the monotony on the 4th afternoon. The informant's voice trembled through the line with fresh terror, the sound of heavy breathing rattling the cheap speaker of the phone. "I'm shaking here, Bain," Russell stammered, the background noise suggesting he was hiding in a public bathroom. A high-level enforcer from the Twin Cities Collective just returned from a meeting in Chicago. He was seen at a private club with a man matching the description from your map, Bain. "The cold one. The one who doesn't use a sire name. The meeting happened 3 weeks ago." "Are you sure it was him?" Bain asked, his voice dead and level. "The enforcer was terrified when he came back," Russell whispered. "People only look that way when they've been talking to old blood. It's him. He's in Chicago." The destination was an absolute nightmare for a hunter. Chicago possessed vampires the way the Iron Range possessed ore, deeply embedded in the city's foundations, supported by ancient wealth, corrupt city officials, and institutionalized cruelty. Preparations for the journey required a massive expansion of the blood supply. A tense meeting was arranged with Samuel Cook behind a closed medical waste facility near the docks, the scent of rotting fish hanging heavy in the damp air. The request for a double shipment on short notice shattered the administrator's fragile composure. "This is too much blood, Bain," Samuel muttered, his hands shaking as he adjusted his glasses and looked toward the security cameras on the far wall. "The clinic audit is still ongoing. You're going to get me caught, and I am too old to go to federal prison. What the hell do you need this much plasma for anyway? Are you selling it?" An icy, detached response spilled out before the anger could be checked, Bain stepping into the older man's personal space until their jackets brushed. "Fix it, Samuel. I pay you enough to handle the risk without complaints. Just get the bags into the cooler by midnight, or I'll find someone else who wants the money." The older man shrunk back into his coat, a look of genuine fear crossing his weathered face as he stared at the faint amber ring visible in Bain's irises. "Fine," Samuel whispered, looking down at the gravel. "Just take it and go. Don't come back until next month." The transaction was completed in total silence, but the sudden shift in the administrator's gaze was a bitter reminder of the human cost of this crusade. A visit to the convention center was the final administrative task before departure. Dorothy Reed sat behind her cluttered desk, a heavy ledger open before her as the request for 2 weeks of unpaid leave was submitted on a wrinkled piece of paper. "Are you in trouble, McGregor?" Dorothy asked, her sharp eyes scanning his pale face and the dark circles under his eyes. She set her pen down with a loud slap. "You look like hell. Worse than usual, and that's saying something." "I'm fine, Dorothy. Just have some family business to take care of down south," came the smooth, practiced lie. "People who are fine don't forfeit 2 weeks of pay to go chasing ghosts in the middle of winter," she grunted, her thumb rubbing her arthritic knee. "You have that look my brother had before he went off to jail. Like you're walking into a wall on purpose." "It's just something I have to finish," Bain said, looking at the floorboards. "You eat something before you get on the highway," she sighed, dragging the ledger toward her and signing the authorization with a heavy hand. "You're shrinking right in front of me, kid. Whatever it is, don't let it kill you. I don't want to train a replacement." An overwhelming urge to confess the truth flared up in that quiet, heated office. For 5 agonizing seconds, the secret teetered on the edge of disclosure. The desire to tell another human being what he was, to explain the hunger, the map, and the midnight hunts, was almost a physical ache in his throat. He wanted someone to know he wasn't just a drifter. "Thank you, Dorothy," was all that finally came out. Midnight arrived with a bitter wind that swept across the gravel parking lot of the apartment building. The canvas duffel bags were loaded into the trunk of the Impala, alongside the heavy, reinforced blood cooler. A soft click of a car door, echoing through the darkness, drew Bain's attention to the shadows behind his vehicle. Victoria Sanders stood by the driver's side of her black SUV, her hands buried deep within her pockets as she watched him work under the flickering streetlights. The Covenant possessed resources that stretched far beyond Minnesota, and her presence made it clear that permission was neither sought nor required. "You're going to get yourself slaughtered down there if you go in blind," Victoria said, her voice dry and steady. "Chicago isn't Duluth. They own the police districts. They own the docks." "I didn't ask for your advice, Victoria," Bain said, slamming the Impala's trunk shut with a loud metallic clang. "And I didn't ask for a shadow. I'm not offering advice, McGregor. I'm telling you how it is," she replied, stepping into the light. "We have a warehouse in Cicero. My people are already setting up a perimeter near the loop. You can drive down there alone and die in an alley, or you can accept that we're hunting the same thing." A long, silent standoff stretched between the two individuals under the amber lights. Bain didn't answer her. He climbed into the driver's seat of the Impala and turned the ignition key, the rough idle shaking the steering wheel and filling the exhaust pipe with a cloud of dark smoke. Victoria slipped into her SUV immediately after, her headlights cutting through his rearview mirror. The two vehicles rolled out of the lot in tandem, heading south toward the Illinois border like two predators bound by a common enemy, but sworn to absolute solitude. A city that knows how to keep secrets. Chicago in March offered no comfort, only a bitter, biting wind that roared off Lake Michigan with a vicious intensity. The water possessed the exact same dead ocean quality as Lake Superior, but the waves here felt angrier, crashing against the concrete piers of the shoreline like something trapped and desperate. Separate living arrangements were established immediately to maintain operational distance. Victoria utilized a secure Covenant safe house, hidden behind the drab facade of a residential street in Wicker Park. A rundown motel room in Pilsen served as a temporary base for Bain, the small space smelling permanently of stale cigarette smoke and decades of damp carpet. The bleak anonymity suited his disposition perfectly, providing a quiet room where the red string map could be reconstructed on a smaller scale. Intelligence gathering consumed the first 3 days in the city. Contacts were pressured, leads were chased, and a significant breakthrough occurred through a vampire-adjacent information dealer named Philip Morgan. The 50-year-old criminal ran a high-end antique shop in Logan Square as a legitimate cover, selling historical artifacts to wealthy collectors and dangerous secrets to anyone with enough cash and an absolute lack of moral objections. Bain despised the man's parasitic nature, but found his ledger incredibly useful. "Malcolm has been in the city for 6 weeks, Philip whispered, his fingers nervous as he adjusted a silver pocket watch on the counter between them. "The old bastard isn't hiding, Bain. He's organizing. He's already secured private audience with the heads of the 2 largest vampire families in the district, the Torres Network and the Bell Network." Bain leaned over the glass counter, his face carved from stone. "Those families have been cutting each other's throats for 40 years, Philip. Why are they talking now?" "Because Malcolm is offering them something bigger than a turf war," Philip replied, his voice dropping an octave as he glanced toward the storefront window. "The fact that he's brokering an alliance between Raymond Torres and Virginia Bell means the old rules don't apply anymore. If those 2 factions shake hands, this city becomes a slaughterhouse with a corporate board of directors." Victoria confirmed the exact same intelligence through her own military channels later that evening. A quiet diner in Pilsen served as the meeting spot, the ambient clatter of silverware providing decent cover for the conversation. Victoria ordered a full plate of eggs and hash browns, while a single cup of black coffee sat untouched in front of Bain. "The Torres Network is headed by Raymond Torres," Victoria explained, tapping a fork against her plate to emphasize the point. He presents himself as a 40-year-old commercial real estate developer, very polished, very patient. He manages roughly 30 full-blooded vampires and at least 60 human collaborators embedded in the local zoning offices. He isn't the type to be taken by surprise. Bain stared at the dark liquid in his cup, his eyes catching the amber reflection of the neon clock on the wall. And the other one? Bell. Virginia Bell is ancient, Victoria said, her eyes shifting to his untouched drink. Covenant record suggests she hasn't left her brownstone mansion in Gold Coast for over 30 years. She sends representatives to handle her business, and everyone who has ever encountered her describes her as profoundly dangerous. She isn't dangerous because of speed or strength, McGregor. She's dangerous because she's lived long enough to know exactly how every human conflict ends before it even starts. Malcolm wants to unite them, Bain said. The Covenant believes a unification like this has never been successfully executed in the Midwest, Victoria warned, leaning forward across the table. If his plan succeeds, it creates a vampire power structure with unprecedented reach, resources, and political protection. We need to plan a coordinated strike with our full regional team. I don't care about the politics, Bain muttered, his voice cold and flat. I only care about the room where he's going to be standing. Surveillance of the tour's logistics lines eventually yielded the exact location of the summit. A private, multi-level event space in the West Loop had been rented for a single night under an anonymous shell company. The meeting was scheduled to take place in 4 days. A violent argument erupted in the Wicker Park safe house when Bain announced his intention to handle the infiltration alone. Victoria paced the length of the hardwood floor, her controlled fury radiating through the small room as her operatives prepared weapons in the background. "You are going to get yourself slaughtered, Bain," Victoria snapped, her hand slamming down onto a tactical map. This isn't a raid on a remote supply warehouse full of low-level couriers. This is a summit of ancient bloodlines. Malcolm is a 200-year-old apex predator. The moment you step into that building, he will smell his own blood in the air and he will be waiting for you. Bain listened to her warnings without blinking, his jacket already zipped up to his chin. "I know exactly how old he is, Victoria. And I know he'll be ready. I'm going anyway." Midnight arrived, shrouded in a heavy Chicago fog that masked the approach to the West Loop facility. Infiltration was executed through an unsecured service entrance near the loading docks, Bain moving through the shadows of the concrete corridor like a ghost that belonged in the structure's foundations. His senses guided him upward, leading him toward a closed mezzanine level that overlooked the main banquet room. The area had been boarded up during a previous renovation, but never properly secured, providing a perfect vantage point directly above the center table. A sudden sound chilled the air in the dark gallery. A voice rose from the floor below, measured, precise, and infinitely persuasive. Bain froze, his chest tightening as he heard his father speak for the very first time in his life. The timbre of the voice was terrifyingly familiar. It sounded exactly like Bain's own voice, if every shred of human emotion, guilt, and mercy had been systematically scraped away from the vocal cords. "The old ways are inefficient, Raymond," Malcolm was saying, his figure visible through the floorboards as he stood before the two family heads. "Slaughtering humans in dark alleys and hiding from federal agencies is a century-old survival tactic. I am proposing an embedded network. We do not run from their institutions, we purchase them. We integrate our logistics into their local government supply chains, their corporate pharmaceutical distribution, and their shipping corridors. We become the foundation of the infrastructure, and when we do, we become impossible to remove." Bain became so utterly captivated by the sound of that cold voice that his administrative guard dropped entirely. The faint scuff of a leather shoe against the concrete behind him arrived a fraction of a second too late. A heavy, blunt impact slammed into the back of Bain's skull, the force of the strike sending him crashing through the fragile wooden mezzanine railing. A 15-foot plunge ended with a sickening thud against the polished hardwood floor of the banquet hall below. A sharp, wet crack echoed through the room as his left arm took the full brunt of the landing. The bone in his forearm splintered beneath the skin, a white-hot flash of agony blinding his vision for 3 agonizing seconds. Stopping was not an option, he understood. Bain dragged himself to his feet using his right hand, his breathing ragged as his amber eyes flared with absolute ferocity. The banquet room emptied with supernatural efficiency, the main targets vanishing through secure side exits before Bain could even clear the fog from his eyes. By the time he stood fully upright, Malcolm was completely gone, leaving 4 younger, black-eyed enforcers to clean up the intrusion. The conflict that followed was a masterclass in raw, ugly survival. 4 full-blooded vampires descended on him simultaneously, their movements a blur of lethal speed. Bain fought like an animal, using his right arm to drive a silver spike through the chest of the nearest enforcer, turning the creature into a cloud of gray ash before its teeth could sink into his throat. A heavy kick from behind shattered 2 of Bain's ribs, throwing him into a marble pillar that cracked under the force of his body. Another enforcer raked its razor-sharp nails across his left cheek, tearing open a deep, bleeding gash that exposed the white bone beneath the flesh. He didn't speak. He didn't scream. He simply absorbed the damage, using his superior mass to tackle the remaining attackers through a heavy glass display case, using the jagged shards to sever the tendons in their limbs before limping toward the rear exit. Bain won the engagement only in the sense that he walked out of the building alive. He stumbled through 4 blocks of dark alleys, his left arm dangling uselessly at his side as blood soaked through the canvas of his jacket. The Impala was waiting in the shadows where he had left it. He managed to shift the transmission into drive using his right hand, his vision blurring twice before the vehicle pulled into the motel parking lot in Pilsen. He sat on the edge of the stained porcelain bathtub, his teeth gritted until they cracked as he braced his broken forearm against the rim of the sink. A heavy, sickening pull reset the bone, the agony drawing a low, guttural growl from the back of his throat. A quiet click of the motel door lock signaled an arrival 20 minutes later. Victoria Sanders stepped into the small, brightly lit bathroom, her face pale but entirely devoid of judgment. She didn't offer a single lecture or an arrogant reminder of her previous warnings. She simply dropped her tactical pack onto the tiles, sat down on the linoleum floor beside him, and pulled a roll of medical tape and a bottle of antiseptic from her kit. "Hold your breath," Victoria murmured, her fingers surprisingly steady as she pressed a sterile gauze pad against the deep laceration on his cheek. Bain remained motionless, his body shivering slightly as the half-vampire cells began the slow, painful process of knitting the flesh back together around the tape. The silence in the small bathroom stretched on for an hour, broken only the sound of tearing adhesive and the steady hum of the motel's plumbing. He looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink, a single word forming in the back of his throat, but Victoria caught his eye and shook her head before he could speak it. "Don't, McGregor," she said softly, packing the bloody gauze back into her bag. "Just save your strength. We still have a long way to go." What it means to heal slowly. 10 agonizing days dissolved into the gray Chicago dampness, while Bain's body struggled to repair the structural devastation from the West Loop confrontation. A half-vampire biology ensured accelerated cellular regeneration, but a shattered radius and ulna required more than a few hours to mend. The crude, violent resetting executed against the porcelain sink left the arm slightly crooked beneath the thick layers of medical tape. Every shift of his weight or lift of a duffel bag sent a hot, grinding agony radiating from the fracture site straight to his shoulder blade. Throughout this prolonged confinement, Victoria remained in close proximity. Operational duties kept her occupied at the Wicker Park safe house during the daylight hours, but the evenings found her sitting in the motel's single vinyl armchair, a file folder open on her lap. Conversations developed naturally over those quiet nights, representing the closest approximation of companionship Bain had experienced in a decade. He handled the unfamiliar dynamic with the clumsy, defensive awkwardness of an individual who had long since forgotten how to exist without a weapon in his hand. "You're flinching every time you reach for that water glass," Victoria observed one evening, not looking up from a tactical logistics printout. "The bone is knitting wrong, McGregor. Let me cut that tape and set it properly." "It's fine," Bain said, his voice flat as he stared at the water stain on the ceiling tiles. "It holds. That's all it needs to do. Suit yourself. Wear the limp if you want to," she replied, her tone perfectly even. She flipped a page in her folder. "The regional files say you've been running this circuit since you were 18. No partners. No safe houses. Just an old car and a map." "Partners make noise," Bain said. "They get soft. Then they get dead." "And going it alone keeps you sharp?" Victoria asked, her sharp eyes finally shifting to his face. "Is that what happened in the West Loop? You looked real sharp coming over that mezzanine railing." Bain didn't answer. He turned his head toward the dark window, watching the sleet slide down the glass. Personal history emerged slowly during those long hours of forced stillness. Victoria had suffered a catastrophic loss 8 years prior, when a low-level feeding cell slaughtered her 22-year-old brother in an alley behind a Minneapolis music venue. 6 months of blind rage eventually led her to the recruitment offices of the Covenant. Grief no longer served as the primary motivator, or at least that was the narrative she repeated to herself. Institutional necessity and the preservation of human order had taken its place. Bain listened to the disclosure in silence, withholding the deep admiration he felt because verbalizing such a sentiment felt like opening a door he preferred to keep locked. "What about your mother?" Victoria inquired later that night, her pen hovering over a map of the Indiana transit lines. "The file says her name was Sharon. Sharon McGregor." "She was 24, Bain said, his voice dropping into a dry clinical register. "A nursing student at St. Luke's." The hospital staff told the social workers she had a good academic record. "She bled out on the delivery table because my bones were too dense for a human pelvis to pass safely. That's the extent of the history. There isn't anything else to tell." Victoria lowered the paperwork to her lap, her expression shifting into something quiet and remarkably steady. "I'm sorry, Bain. That's a hell of a debt to carry from the day you're born." The sentiment lacked the hollow pity of a social worker, carrying a genuine weight that didn't aggravate the old wound. "Have you considered the day after?" she asked a few minutes later, her pen tapping a rhythmic cadence against her knee. "Say you track Malcolm down to whatever hole he's digging. Say you manage to put a spike through his ribs. What happens on the morning after that?" "I kill him," Bain stated simply. "And then?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice flat. "That's what worries me, McGregor," Victoria said, looking back down at her files. "Men who don't plan for the morning after usually don't survive the night before." He offered no response to the observation, turning his face toward the dark window. "A severe biological crisis, manifested by the 6th day of recovery. Physical trauma and the massive expenditure of energy required to knit broken bones and torn muscle tissue completely exhausted his internal reserves." The reinforced plastic cooler in the Impala's trunk sat empty, the sterile bags discarded in a dumpster miles away. A frantic text to Samuel Cook yielded only a panicked refusal. Federal oversight made an interstate shipment from Duluth an impossibility. The deprivation altered his physical appearance rapidly, the metallic amber hue spreading outward from his pupils until the natural brown of his irises was reduced to a thin, frantic ring. His hands developed a persistent tremor, his disposition soured, and a volatile, hair-trigger tension defined his every movement. The necessity of survival forced a confession on the seventh night. Realizing that a complete cognitive collapse would transform him into an immediate physical threat to anyone within a 3-block radius, Bain stood before Victoria in the cramped bathroom light. "My reserves are gone," he explained, his voice remaining flat and devoid of self-pity despite the gold light flaring violently in his eye sockets. "The broken arm used up the baseline supply. If the saturation drops another 10%, the cognitive filter fails. I won't be able to distinguish between a target and a civilian. You need to vacate the room if I start losing coordination." Victoria didn't flinch, nor did she reach for the sidearm strapped to her ribs. She studied the unnatural expansion of his pupils with the detached curiosity of a clinician. "How long do you have before the baseline drops?" 12 hours, Bain said, gripping the edge of the sink to still his fingers. "Maybe 10. Stay here." "Lock the door from the inside," she ordered, reaching for her jacket. A single phone call was placed from the motel parking lot. The following afternoon, a silent Covenant courier arrived at the door, delivering a heavy, unlabeled insulated container packed with chilled bags of typo-negative plasma. Bain asked no questions regarding the legality of the acquisition, and Victoria offered no explanation. He retreated into the bathroom alone, tearing the ports open with his teeth and consuming the thick, cold fluid until the pressure behind his eyes receded. When he finally emerged, his eyes had settled back into their natural brown, his posture steady once more. "Thank you," he muttered, the utterance carrying a profound significance that far exceeded the simple vocabulary. A sharp vibration from the burner phone interrupted the quiet on the 9th evening. Russell Brooks' voice crackled through the speaker, distorted by long-distance static. "The Chicago enforcers lost contact with Malcolm's personal courier 12 hours ago," Russell stammered, the sound of heavy breathing rattling the speaker. "A transit manifest out of Gary shows a private vehicle registry linked to his network heading east into Indiana. Cleveland is the likely staging area, or somewhere further along the eastern corridor." "Is he still traveling by vehicle?" Bain demanded. "The registry says an unmarked commercial van," Russell said. "He's moving fast, Bain. If you don't catch him in Ohio, he disappears into the eastern grid." The trail remained viable, though reduced to a thread. An administrative detail required attention before the departure from Cook County could be executed. Bain returned to Logan Square on the final night, slipping through the rear entrance of the antique shop while the streetlights flickered to life. He had spent 48 hours verifying a critical piece of operational data. Philip Morgan had pocketed $10,000 from a tour's lieutenant in exchange for a description of the tall, amber-eyed hunter asking questions in Pilsen. The antiquarian was the direct cause of the mezzanine ambush and the fractured forearm. The ensuing confrontation within the darkened showroom was devoid of cinematic flourishes or excessive noise. A heavy oak cabinet shattered as Morgan's 50-year-old frame was driven into the glass doors. Bain's right hand clamped over the man's throat with the unyielding strength of a hydraulic press. "Please," Morgan choked out, his eyes bulging as the shards of antique glass cut into his jacket. "I didn't have a choice. They would have skinned me, Bain." "You always have a choice, Philip," Bain whispered, his face inches from the broker's bleeding cheek. "You chose the money. If I see your face in this state when I come back, I won't use the rebar. I'll use my hands." No blood was spilled on the Persian rugs, but the low, terrifying collection of instructions delivered into Morgan's ear left the broker vomiting from sheer terror on the floorboards. Bain did not terminate his life, but the proximity of the transition was understood by both parties before the iron grip was released. The Impala rolled eastward out of the Chicago suburbs at midnight, its tires humming against the concrete of the interstate. Bain drove with a crookedly healed left arm, two ribs that still throbbed with every deep breath, and a jagged pink laceration across his cheek that had hardened into a permanent scar. Every instance of his eyelids closing brought the precise, clinical timbre of his father's voice screaming through his memory, a cold blueprint for a kingdom he intended to tear down piece by piece. Some monsters are just people. The trail turned eastward through Cleveland, then doubled back into the gray, industrial sprawl of Detroit. Malcolm was moving with a terrifying, deliberate speed, not fleeing the destruction left behind in Chicago, but building upon it. Each major municipality along the interstate corridor hosted a secret assembly, a formal handclasp, and a binding transactional agreement. The structural blueprint for a unified Midwestern vampire collective was becoming a reality, and Bain remained perpetually 24 hours behind the architect of the design. The local operational cells in Detroit introduced a different category of adversary, the human collaborators. These individuals were not desperate, trafficked captives huddled on mattresses, nor were they hollow-eyed puppets operating under the foggy influence of a vampire's psychological compulsion. These were citizens who possessed complete awareness of the anomalous entities they served, having made a conscious, calculating business decision to facilitate the network's growth in exchange for astronomical financial premiums. Jeffrey Clark, 47, served as the primary administrative link. As a senior logistics manager for a prominent regional medical supply corporation, he possessed the authority to manipulate inventory records, diverting expired and unlisted whole blood products away from state incinerators and into the cooling units of vampire syndicates. He resided in an affluent, tree-lined neighborhood in Grosse Pointe, maintained a pristine marriage, and had 2 teenage children enrolled in a prestigious private high school. Bain spent 3 agonizing days parked down the street from the Clark residence, his eyes tracking the man's mundane daily routines through the windshield of the Impala. He watched Jeffrey shovel the driveway, kiss his wife on the porch, and help his son load a hockey bag into the trunk of a luxury SUV. The normalcy of the spectacle was deeply unsettling. The man was not a monster born of dark folklore. He was a corporate bureaucrat who had selected a path of complicity 6 years ago and renewed that commitment every single month since, insulating his conscience with the lie that his actions were entirely victimless. The apprehension was executed on the 4th evening, inside a dimly lit underground parking structure downtown. Jeffrey had just unlocked his sedan when a heavy, canvas-jacketed figure stepped out from behind a concrete support pillar, blocking the driver's side door entirely. "Jeffrey Clark," Bain said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly level register. Jeffrey flinched, his corporate security badge rattling against his lanyard as he attempted to push past. "Excuse me. I don't have any loose change. Step back or I'm calling the garage attendant." A sudden, iron-hard grip wrapped around Jeffrey's collar, driving his spine violently against the side window of his own vehicle. The glass groaned under the sudden pressure. Bain leaned in close, his face completely shadowed save for the distinct, liquid gold rings flaring around his pupils. "The garage attendant isn't coming, Jeffrey," Bain whispered, his right hand applying just enough pressure to the man's throat to cut off his breath. "We're going to discuss the inventory discrepancies at the regional blood repository. And you're going to speak very quickly." The interrogation yielded immediate results. Jeffrey was a bureaucrat, entirely unequipped for physical confrontation or the stark reality of violence. Within 5 minutes of being pinned against the cold steel of his vehicle, his corporate composure dissolved into frantic, weeping compliance. "I didn't kill anyone," Jeffrey sobbed, his hands shaking as he clutched at Bain's forearm. "They just gave me an encrypted routing number. The money goes into an offshore account in Grand Cayman. It's just plasma that was going to be thrown out anyway. Please, my kids are at home." "Give me the distribution contacts," Bain commanded, increasing the torque on the man's shirt collar. "Names and communication frequencies." "Now." Jeffrey surrendered 4 operational links without hesitation. 2 human administrative accomplices within the municipal records office, and 2 high-level vampire handlers managing the Ohio-Michigan transit lines. Once the data was recorded on the burner phone, Bain dragged the manager out to the alley behind the structure, where Victoria Sanders was waiting beside her idling SUV. The Covenant possessed highly specialized methods for processing human collaborators, arrangements that involved no formal police reports, judicial hearings, or public records, but ensured the individuals were permanently removed from positions of public trust. Jeffrey Clark would never step foot inside a medical supply facility again. The implementation of the newly acquired data required an immediate offensive strike against the 2 vampire network contacts. Jason Bell, an enforcer who appeared 30 but had survived nearly 80 years within the regional syndicates, was located inside an abandoned automotive tool and die shop on the city's periphery. He was an arrogant creature, accustomed to dominating terrified human couriers, and he underestimated Bain's unique hybrid capability catastrophically. The resulting confrontation within the dark factory bay was brief and devastating. Jason attempted to utilize his superior agility, leaping from a raised storage mezzanine with his fangs bared, but Bain anticipated the trajectory. He stepped inside the strike, absorbing a massive blow to his left side that dislocated his shoulder with a wet, heavy pop. Ignoring the white-hot agony, Bain used his right arm to drive a silver spike upward through the underside of the enforcer's jaw, piercing the brain stem. The creature stiffened violently before crumbling into a mountain of dark, volatile ash that mixed with the oil stains on the concrete. Limping into the adjacent loading dock, while a freezing Michigan rain poured through a shattered skylight above, Bain braced his back against a steel support girder. With a single, brutal shove against the iron structure, he forced his left humeral head back into the joint, a guttural snarl escaping his gritted teeth as the muscles locked back into position. The second target, Diana Rodriguez, proved far more perceptive. She caught the scent of ash and ozone from half a block away, abandoning her secure apartment through a fire escape before Bain could establish a physical perimeter. The escape left him absolutely furious, his fist shattering a wooden door frame as he filed her description into his memory for future liquidation. The 2 human administrative accomplices were addressed before dawn. The first individual cooperated instantly upon seeing the dried ash on Bain's boots, surrendering his digital access logs. The second accomplice, Kevin Powell, 55, was a mid-level city zoning official who had spent 12 years facilitating clandestine vampire property acquisitions through the systematic falsification of land titles and corporate tax records. Powell sat behind an expensive mahogany desk in his private study, a glass of scotch in his hand, entirely convinced that his political connections rendered him untouchable. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Powell sneered, refusing to look up from his tablet when Bain stepped through the French doors of the study. "You're a drifter in a torn jacket. I can have 3 police cruisers outside this house before you can reach that desk." Bain didn't speak. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides, his right hand closing over the front of Powell's silk robe and hoisting the senior official entirely out of his leather chair. He threw the man across the room, his heavy body smashing through a glass display case containing historic surveyor maps. "The local police districts don't cover the rooms I operate in, Kevin," Bain said, stepping over the shattered glass until his shadow completely obscured the official's face. Up close, the amber light in his eyes was blinding, devoid of any human restraint. "The property titles you cleared for the shell corporations in the West Loop, who gave you the authorization codes?" Powell stared up at the towering figure, his comfortable, insulated reality completely fracturing as he looked into the eyes of a literal predator. The arrogance vanished, replaced by an immediate, trembling terror that forced him to recount every encrypted message he had received over the last calendar year. Despite the wealth of local logistics recovered, a direct pipeline to Malcolm remained frustratingly elusive. Every piece of intelligence recovered from the Detroit cell was strictly compartmentalized, situated one full layer away from the source. The architect remained standardly detached, manipulating the infrastructure from behind an impenetrable wall of digital encryption and human proxies, leaving absolutely no physical signatures or traceable footprints behind. Victoria stood beside the Impala, in the driveway of Powell's estate, as the morning sun began to turn the low clouds a dull orange. She watched Bain wrap a fresh layer of athletic tape around his newly reset shoulder, her expression tight with a concern she had previously tried to conceal. "He's not dropping these leads by accident, Bain," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the early morning quiet. "Think about the timeline. Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit. Every time we hit a wall, a human collaborator practically drops a fresh address into our laps. Malcolm is an ancient intelligence. He doesn't leave his logistics managers completely exposed unless he wants the trail to be followed." Bain didn't pause his hands, tightening the adhesive tape with his teeth before pulling his canvas sleeve down. "It doesn't change anything. It changes the entire risk calculation," she insisted, stepping into his line of sight. "If he's leading you across the Midwest on a leash, he's choosing the final destination. He's setting the parameters of the room where you finally catch him. He knows what you are, and he knows exactly how you fight." "I don't care about the parameters," Bain stated, his voice completely flat as he opened the driver's side door. "And I don't care about the calculation. He was there when my mother died, and he walked out. That's the only calculation that matters." Victoria looked at him for a long, silent interval, her blue eyes tracking the permanent pink scar across his cheek and the slight, crooked set of his left forearm. Neither of them vocalized the conclusion they had both reached over the course of the journey. The path they were traveling was designed to terminate in a room where survival was a statistical impossibility. A final, encrypted data packet emerged from Powell's personal server 20 minutes later, breaking the deadlock. A specific commercial real estate transfer had been authorized for a subterranean rail transit hub located beneath the downtown sector of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Unlike the previous administrative leads, this transfer log contained a mandatory physical verification protocol requiring the personal attendance of the network's architect. The meeting was confirmed to take place in exactly 6 days. For the first time since the West Loop mezzanine collapsed, Bain possessed a realistic operational window to reach the target before the room went completely dark. He turned the key in the ignition, the rough vibration of the Impala's engine shaking the steering wheel as the vehicle pointed toward the Pennsylvania Turnpike. The thing about fathers. Pittsburgh was a labyrinth built in deep river valleys, a city defined by iron bridges that arched over the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio rivers like an old skeleton holding the landscape together. Bain arrived 48 hours ahead of the scheduled summit, checking into a windowless motel along the river corridor. He was meticulous in a way he had not been since the early days in northern Minnesota, mapping every transit line, every sewer outlet, and every high-altitude escape route within a 2-mile radius of the target. He had underestimated his father's network twice. He could not afford a third failure. Victoria Sanders was already established in the city when the Impala crossed the city limits. The realization that she had outpaced his travel timeline ceased to surprise him somewhere around the Ohio border. Her resources and tactical positioning were becoming as predictable as his own isolation. The Covenant maintained a deeply entrenched, multi-decade presence in western Pennsylvania, providing an unparalleled level of regional intelligence. They identified the exact location of the summit, a highly exclusive, private social club situated on the steep bluffs of Mt. Washington, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the entire downtown skyline. It was a sanctuary of old steel money and ancient bloodlines, a location Malcolm had frequented during the expansion of his logistics lines in the late 90s. Unlike the previous operational briefings, the tactical plan was constructed through genuine collaboration. There were no unilateral dictates from Bain or furious objections from Victoria. Instead, two operatives sat across a laminate table in the motel room, analyzing blueprints and cross-referencing radio frequencies like a functional unit. Bain recognized the shift in the dynamic, the unfamiliar weight of shared responsibility settling into the room, but he remained silent, focusing entirely on the logistics. Timothy Foster will manage the northern perimeter with the secondary Covenant squad, Victoria explained, her finger tracing the alleyways behind the MT. Washington Bluff. I'll handle the primary service exits. If anyone tries to break for the incline or the lower road, we filter them into the bottleneck. You go inside the main hall. You locate Malcolm, and you terminate the asset. Keep the perimeter tight, Bain said, his voice flat. If the exits leak, the whole grid goes cold. It's a simple entry. Every simple plan fails when the execution begins. The night of the summit arrived under a low, coal-gray cloud cover. Infiltration of the social club revealed an immediate, catastrophic intelligence failure. The interior was occupied by nearly 15 full-blooded vampires, far exceeding the initial estimate of 8. A security leak had occurred within the lower tiers of the regional Covenant command structure, alerting the syndicate to an imminent raid. Bain cleared the main foyer before the administrative security could register his presence. His unique biology worked to his advantage in the crowded room. The human half of his genetic signature read as entirely baseline to the casual observers drinking highballs near the bar. He moved past the velvet curtains and into the private boardroom at the rear of the facility, his hand closed around a silver rebar spike concealed within his canvas sleeve. Malcolm was there, seated behind a mahogany desk, entirely alone. It was the first time Bain had occupied the same physical room as his father. The older vampire looked 40, possessed of a timeless, unblemished composure that felt entirely disconnected from the concept of mortality. He looked exactly like Bain would look in 20 winters, if Bain ever ceased the daily, exhausting performance of pretending to be human. He sat with his hands folded over a leather blotter, his posture indicating he had been anticipating this specific intrusion for several hours. He studied the tall, scarred hunter with the detached, analytical interest of a craftsman inspecting a tool he had designed long ago. "Bain," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the precise, rhythmic timbre Bain had heard through the mezzanine floorboards in Chicago. The pronunciation was authoritative, stripping away the McGregor name as if he owned the exclusive rights to the boy's identity. Bain did not raise the weapon immediately. He stood 5 feet from the desk, his breathing heavy, his amber eyes locked onto the face that had haunted his sleep from the day he was old enough to understand his own reflection. "Why did you leave?" Bain asked. He did not ask why his mother had been destroyed. He understood the biological reality that a 24-year-old human body could not survive the delivery of a dampier child. He asked why he had been left behind on a sterile hospital mattress in Duluth, a ward of the state with no history. Malcolm's expression did not soften into regret, nor did it harden into malice. He spoke with the flat, unyielding clarity of an accountant reading a balance sheet. "I am not constructed for the requirements of an infant, Bain. Sentiment, paternal attachment, civic responsibility, these are the psychological mechanisms of creatures that die in 80 years. By the time your mother was admitted to that facility, I had been alive long enough that a child, even one bearing my own genetic markers, registered as a logistical complication rather than a justification to alter my trajectory. I did not leave to punish you. I left because you were non-essential to the framework." The vampire paused, his eyes tracking the deep pink scar on Bain's cheek. "And yet you survived the foster system. You tracked my logistics from Minnesota to Pennsylvania. You turned out highly capable, Bain. It seems my absence was the most effective piece of training you could have received." The comment was delivered as a compliment, a cold, twisted gift from a creator to his creation. Bain struck him. The blow was delivered with the absolute limit of his hybrid strength, a right hook that shattered the mahogany desk and drove Malcolm through the drywall of the adjacent partition. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough against 2 centuries of predatory instinct. The conflict that erupted in the rear offices of the MT. Washington Club was completely devoid of cinematic grace. It was a brutal, industrial slaughter. Bain fought with the frantic, pain-driven mechanics of a man who had been broken since childhood, while Malcolm moved with the fluid, effortless efficiency of an apex predator that had forgotten the concept of fear. Furniture was reduced to splinters within 30 seconds. A heavy backhand from Malcolm caught Bain across the jaw, reopening the jagged laceration on his left cheek and spraying dark blood across the wallpaper. In the scramble near the shattered doorway, Malcolm reversed Bain's grip on the silver spike, driving the metal tip deep into the meat of Bain's left shoulder. Bain didn't scream. He used his right hand to rip the hot iron out of his own flesh, lunging forward again with his teeth bared. He got close. Genuinely close. For a 3-second interval, Bain managed to pin the older vampire against the iron radiator, his fingers digging into Malcolm's throat until the skin began to bruise. For a fraction of a second, the ancient composure vanished from Malcolm's face, replaced by a raw, instinctive panic before his heels found leverage against the floorboards. Then the remaining 15 vampires broke through the rear security doors, responding to the sound of the collapsing walls. Outside on the bluff, the sound of automatic gunfire echoed through the sleet as Victoria and Timothy Foster blew the perimeter lines, attempting to force an entry. But the Covenant tactical reinforcements were still 8 minutes out, and 8 minutes was an eternity inside a room filled with black-eyed enforcers. Malcolm did not stay to watch the conclusion. While Bain was pinned to the floor by 3 younger vampires, his fingers clawing at their throats to keep their fangs away from his jugular, the older man rose from the debris. He stood in the center of the ruined office, calmly brushed the plaster dust from the lapels of his tailored wool coat, straightened his tie, and exited through the rear fire stairwell without looking back. He was gone before the first enforcer's head was severed. Bain killed the nearest attacker with a broken table leg, incapacitated 2 more with a series of heavy, blind strikes to the knee joints, and was then hit by a 4th enforcer with enough velocity to launch his body through a lath and plaster wall into the secondary service corridor. The impact turned the world dark for approximately 90 seconds. When his vision cleared, he was lying flat on the concrete floor of the service hallway. The overhead fluorescent tube flickered violently, casting a harsh, white glare over Victoria's face as she knelt beside him. She was shouting his name, her hands covered in dark blood as she checked his pulse, the distant sound of Covenant sirens finally wailing through the MT. Washington tunnels. Bain tried to compile an inventory of his structural damage, but lost sequence after the torso. A cracked orbital bone had swollen his left eye shut. A deep, pulsing puncture wound ruined his left shoulder, and 3 ribs had splintered in the exact same location they had broken in Chicago. The blood loss was extensive enough to terminate a human baseline civilian, and had left his extremities completely numb. "Did he get out?" Bain wheezed, his mouth filling with the copper taste of fluid. Victoria stopped her hands, her blue eyes dark with a grim, hollow finality. "He's gone, Bain." The vehicle cleared the lower checkpoint before Timothy could drop the gate. Bain closed his eyes against the flickering light. He offered no verbal response. The silence in the concrete corridor was absolute. Carol Hayes, the senior Covenant medical specialist, arrived 4 minutes later, dropping a heavy trauma kit onto the floor beside his head. She began slicing through the bloody canvas of his jacket with surgical scissors, her face tight with professional disbelief. "It's an absolute miracle he's still conscious," Carol muttered, pressing a large hemostatic bandage into the shoulder wound. "He's dropped 40% of his volume. We need an emergency transport to the Allegheny General Ward immediately. No hospitals, Victoria said, her voice cutting through the medic's frantic instructions with absolute authority. The registry files are monitored. We handle the stabilization in the vehicle. He's going to code in the back seat, Sanders, Carol warned, adjusting an IV line. He won't code, Victoria snapped. Get the plasma kits from the truck and keep moving. Bain lay flat across the vinyl back seat of Victoria's SUV, his good arm thrown over his forehead to block out the glare of the passing streetlights. The vehicle moved with a steady, rhythmic bounce as it crossed the Liberty Bridge, the dark iron framework of Pittsburgh passing above the tinted windows like the bars of a cage. Behind his closed eyelids, the precise, mechanical cadence of his father's voice replayed with perfect clarity, repeating a single phrase over and over into the dark. You turned out highly capable. He lay there in the blood-stained vinyl, staring into the dark of his own eyelids, realizing the old monster had spoken the words like they were a gift. The weight of the morning after. The interstate did not offer a clean line. It wrapped around the jagged, industrial coal country of eastern Pennsylvania like an old iron chain rusted into the earth. The SUV moved through a thick, gray mountain fog that had rolled down from the Poconos, turning the headlights into dull, orange blurs against the asphalt. In the back seat, Bain lay perfectly motionless beneath a stiff woolen covenant blanket that smelled of oil and dry rot. Every mile of the highway felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. His breathing was shallow, a low, wet rattling that whistled through his broken nose every time his lungs expanded against the tight layers of medical tape. Carol Hayes sat in the front passenger seat, her head tilted back against the headrest, her knuckles white where she gripped the plastic dashboard handle. Every few minutes, her eyes would flick up to the rearview mirror, tracking the erratic, faint pulse visible in the hollow of Bain's throat. His core temperature is dropping again, Carol said, her voice dropping into a flat, exhausted register that bypassed any attempt at medical optimism. The hybrid cell structure is trying to rebuild the orbital bone, but it's pulling the energy from the deep tissue. If we don't get another 6 units of typo into his line before we cross into Lackawanna County, the internal organs are going to start cannibalizing the muscle mass. He's already running on empty, Sanders. Victoria didn't look back. Her hands were locked at the 10-2 positions on the steering wheel, her knuckles completely white against the black leather wrapping. She had been driving for 5 hours without a break, her blue eyes fixed on the white lines of the highway with a manic, unyielding intensity. The Scranton Depot has 3 crates of clinical storage waiting in the basement of the old rail yard. Timothy Foster confirmed the shipment was cleared through the local transit authority before the Pittsburgh cells collapsed. We don't stop until we're inside the perimeter. He might not last the hour, Victoria, Carol muttered, turning her head to look out at the black silhouette of the pine trees passing through the mist. I've never seen a dampier take this much structural damage and keep a pulse. The bone in his shoulder didn't just fracture. Malcolm literally splintered the scapula when he reversed that rebar spike. It's a miracle the metal didn't sever the subclavian artery. From the dark floorboards of the back seat, a dry, raspy sound cut through the steady hum of the tires. Bain's right hand, crusted with dried black blood beneath the fingernails, tightened around the edge of the woolen blanket. The artery is intact, Bain croaked, his voice sounding like 2 dry stones grinding together in the dirt. He didn't open his right eye. The left was completely swollen shut, a purple, distorted mass of bruised flesh that reached down to his cheekbone. Keep driving. Shut up, McGregor, Victoria snapped, though her voice lacked its usual cold authority, wavering slightly as she hit a pothole that caused Bain's entire frame to shudder. You don't have the volume to speak. Save the breath for the room. He didn't run, Bain whispered, ignoring her completely. He dragged his good arm up across his chest, his fingers fumbling with the torn fabric of his canvas jacket, until he found the hard, metallic edge of a fresh silver spike hidden in the interior lining. He walked. He stood in that boardroom, Victoria. He looked at the walls like they were a blueprint he'd already finished drawing. He wasn't afraid of the Covenant. He wasn't even afraid of me. He's an ancient machine, Bain, Victoria said, her eyes shifting to the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second before returning to the fog. Machines don't feel fear. They just execute the program until something jams the gears. We're going to jam the gears. No, Bain said, his gold pupils flaring suddenly in the darkness of the back seat, too fierce, amber embers cutting through the dim cabin light. He's not a machine. That's the lie Cook told me in Duluth. That's the lie the files used to make it look like a tactical problem. He's just a man who lived long enough to forget what it feels like to have a heartbeat in his chest. He's what happens when you spend 200 years deciding that nothing is worth dying for. The vehicle fell silent again as they cleared the mountain pass, the road descending into the deep, coal-stained valley where the city of Scranton lay spread out like a graveyard of brick factories and abandoned iron foundries. It was an old railway hub, a place where lines from New York, Philadelphia, and Buffalo had once converged to move millions of tons of anthracite coal out of the earth. Now it was a hollowed-out concrete shell, its subterranean transit tunnels and switching stations providing the perfect subterranean infrastructure for a network that operated entirely within the shadows of human commerce. They pulled into the rear courtyard of the Lackawanna Transit Yard at 3 in the morning. The rain had started again, a cold, greasy downpour that washed the mountain mud from the SUV's fenders. The facility was completely dark, save for a single amber utility light swinging from a rusted crane above the old repair bays. Timothy Foster stepped out from the shadow of a concrete loading dock, an automatic rifle held low against his thigh, his face pale under the brim of a wet baseball cap. He didn't speak as Victoria killed the engine. He simply dropped his shoulder against the rear passenger door and pulled it open, helping Carol drag Bain's dead weight out of the vehicle. They carried him down a steep flight of concrete stairs that led into the subterranean maintenance vaults beneath the tracks. The air down here was thick with the scent of wet coal dust, ancient battery acid, and the faint, sweet smell of rotting timbers. A single cot had been set up in the center of an old switching room, surrounded by iron panels covered in dead brass levers and cracked pressure gauges. Carol worked for 40 minutes in absolute silence, her hands moving with a rapid, professional efficiency as she hooked 3 separate IV lines into Bain's right arm, draining the thick, cold plasma from the Covenant storage cases directly into his collapsing circulatory system. The effect was immediate and violent. Bain's body began to shiver uncontrollably as the half-vampire cells reacted to the massive influx of fuel, the bone fragments in his shoulder grinding against one another as the deep tissue began to contract and knit. Victoria stood by the iron door, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the amber rings in his eyes slowly recede, replaced by the natural, exhausted brown of his human baseline. The scout teams confirmed his location, Timothy said, stepping into the room with a wet map printout. He didn't look at Bain, he kept his eyes on Victoria. He's at the northern switching terminal, 3 miles up the line. He's got an armored commercial transport waiting on the spurs. He's clearing out the regional archives, Victoria. He knows we hit the Detroit cell, and he's burning the paper trail before he crosses into New Jersey. How many enforcers? Victoria asked. None, Timothy said, shaking his head. That's the strange part. The scouts say he's completely alone. He sent the remaining Chicago survivors east toward Newark 4 hours ago. He's just sitting in the dispatcher's office, waiting for the high-rail car to clear the junction. Victoria lowered her arms, her head turning slowly toward the cot where Bain was already dragging himself upright, his right hand tearing the IV lines out of his skin with a wet, tearing sound. He's waiting for me, Bain said, his boots hitting the concrete floor with a heavy, unyielding thud. He swayed for a moment, his face turning an ashen white as his blood pressure stabilized, but he didn't go back down. He reached for his canvas jacket, his left arm still hanging slightly crooked, the pink scar on his cheek glistening with a fresh bead of dark sweat. "You can't take another engagement tonight, Bain," Carol said, stepping forward with a roll of gauze, her voice rising in frustration. "The shoulder isn't set. The bone density hasn't recovered from the Chicago fracture. If he hits you in that arm again, the radius is going to splinter through the skin." "He won't hit the arm," Bain muttered, his fingers locking around the handle of his heavy iron rebar spike. He looked across the room at Victoria, his eyes entirely clear now, the gold completely gone from the irises. "Are you coming, or am I walking the tracks alone?" Victoria stared at him for a long, heavy interval, the sound of the rain dripping through the ceiling tiles filling the silence between them. "Timothy, stay with the medical gear. Keep the SUV running at the south gate. If we aren't back before the morning shifts start at 5, clear the logs and pull back to Bethlehem." "Victoria," Timothy started. "Move," she said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm command register she had used in the Pilsen diner. She pulled a fresh magazine from her tactical vest, slammed it into the grip of her pistol with a sharp, metallic clack, and pointed toward the dark tunnel exit. "Let's go find your father." They walked the rail lines in absolute darkness, moving through the cavernous concrete tubes that ran beneath the city. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow crunch of their boots over the iron ore ballast between the wooden ties, and the steady hiss of water running down the weeping concrete walls. Bain walked with a slight, persistent limp, his left hand tucked deep into his pocket to stabilize the shattered shoulder, but his stride didn't slacken. He moved with the single-minded focus of a machine that had been set on a terminal trajectory 10 years ago and had finally run out of track. The northern switching terminal was a massive, vaulted chamber where 6 separate rail lines converged beneath an old brick freight house. A single high-rail maintenance truck was idling on the center spur, its diesel engine throwing a low, vibrating rumble through the concrete floorboards. Up in the glass-fronted dispatcher's tower that overlooked the tracks, a single light was burning. They climbed the exterior iron staircase together, their boots making no sound against the wet metal as the rain washed over the stairs. Bain pushed the door open with his right boot. Malcolm was sitting in a swivel chair behind the old iron dispatcher's desk, a small leather ledger open before him. A single green-shaded banker's lamp illuminated his face, casting deep, geometric shadows across his timeless features. He didn't look up when the door clicked open. He simply turned a page in the ledger, his fingers moving with a terrifying, smooth precision. "You're late, Bain," Malcolm said, his voice echoing softly against the glass windows of the tower. "The high-rail car has been clear for 20 minutes. I was beginning to think the regional medical staff had proven uncooperative." Bain stepped into the room, leaving Victoria by the doorway, her pistol raised and locked onto the center of Malcolm's chest. The air in the small office was incredibly cold, smelling of ozone and old paper. "The trail ends here, Malcolm," Bain said, his voice completely flat, his right hand bringing the iron spike up from his side. Malcolm finally raised his eyes, his dark pupils reflecting the green light of the lamp. There was no anger in his expression. There was only that same detached, analytical curiosity that had defined the boardroom in Pittsburgh. He looked at Bain's crooked left arm, the fresh gauze showing through the tears in his jacket, and the deep, angry scar along his jawline. "It only ends if you've found an answer to the question, boy," Malcolm said softly, leaning back in the chair and interlacing his fingers over his knee. "You spent 10 years tracking my name through the mud of every low-level distribution cell in the country. You've broken your body twice in the last fortnight just to stand in this room with me. And for what? To put an iron rod through my heart because a human nursing student couldn't survive a birth 26 years ago." "She had a name," Bain growled, his boots shifting on the linoleum floor, the amber light beginning to seep outward from his pupils like oil spreading over water. Sharon. Names are currency for creatures that rot, Bain, Malcolm replied, his tone remaining perfectly conversational, entirely devoid of malice. She was a brief, biological intersection, an experiment in hybridization that succeeded far beyond the statistical expectations. Look at yourself. You have the bone density of an apex line, the tracking capability of a full-blooded elder, and just enough human stubbornness to keep you moving after the nerves have been severed. You are the only significant thing I have constructed in 2 centuries. I am not your construction, Bain said, his knuckles turning white around the iron spike. Then why are you here? Malcolm asked, standing up slowly from the chair, his tall, tailored frame casting a long shadow across the blueprints on the wall. If you are entirely human, why aren't you in Calgary? Why aren't you working a trade? Why aren't you living the small, warm, pathetic life she would have given you? You are here because the blood in your veins demands the hunt. You are here because you cannot exist without a target, Bain. You are exactly like me. You just chose a different ledger to balance. Victoria stepped forward, her sightline perfectly aligned with the space between the vampire's eyes. He's nothing like you, Malcolm. He doesn't leave his people behind in the dark. Malcolm didn't even turn his head to look at her. He left his childhood in the dark, Agent Sanders. He left every person who ever tried to give him a home because he was too busy looking for my teeth in the shadows. He spent his whole life preparing for a single night, and when this night is over, he's going to realize he doesn't know how to do anything else. The old vampire stepped around the desk, his movements so perfectly smooth they seemed almost stationary until he was standing 3 feet from Bain's chest. He didn't raise his hands. He simply stared down into his son's face, his eyes deep, black pools that seemed to absorb the green light of the room. "Go ahead, Bain," Malcolm whispered, his voice dropping into that low, persuasive timbre that had organized the entire Midwestern transit grid. "Put the spike through the ribs. Finish the circuit. Then walk out into the morning air and see how long it takes for the silence to drive you mad." Bain didn't hesitate. He drove the rebar spike forward with every ounce of his remaining strength, his right shoulder throwing his entire weight into the thrust. The tip entered Malcolm's chest directly below the sternum, the sound of the wool coat tearing followed by a wet, heavy crunch as the silver-plated iron pierced the muscle tissue and locked into the spinal column behind. The ancient vampire didn't scream. His body stiffened violently, his fingers locking around Bain's forearms with an iron grip that threatened to crush the radius entirely. For a single, terrifying second, the 2 men stood locked in a horrific embrace, their identical amber eyes flaring with an identical blinding golden light that illuminated the entire glass tower. Bain leaned in until his forehead was touching his father's cheek, his teeth bared as he forced the iron spike an inch deeper, twisting the metal until he felt the core of the entity begin to fracture beneath the skin. "The morning after isn't your problem," Bain whispered into the old man's ear. Malcolm's grip suddenly relaxed, his fingers sliding down Bain's sleeves like dead leaves. A faint, terrible smile touched the corners of the vampire's gray lips, a final look of recognition passing through his eyes before the black pigmentation dissolved entirely into a dull, lifeless milky white. The structural collapse was instantaneous. The flesh turned to a heavy, volatile gray ash within 3 seconds, the tailored wool coat and leather shoes collapsing into a hollow heap on the linoleum floor as the silver spike clattered against the iron desk legs. Bain stood over the pile of ash, his breath coming in short, agonizing gasps that shook his entire torso. His right hand was covered in the gray residue, his left arm hanging completely dead at his side, where the muscles had finally given up their tension. The amber light in his eyes slowly flickered, dimmed, and then went entirely dark, leaving only the hollow, bloodshot brown of a 26-year-old man who looked like he had lived a century. Victoria lowered her pistol, her chest heaving as she stepped through the plastered dust and stood beside him. She looked down at the empty coat, then up at Bain's profile against the glass windows. Outside, the first faint line of the morning sun was beginning to turn the eastern sky, a cold, bruised purple through the Scranton fog. "Is it done?" she asked softly, her voice sounding incredibly small in the empty dispatcher's office. Bain didn't look at her. He turned his face toward the window, watching the high-rail maintenance truck continue to idle on the tracks below, its diesel exhaust rising into the cold air like a gray ghost that didn't know where to go. "I don't know," Bain said, his voice dropping into a flat, empty void that carried no victory, no relief, and no resolution. He reached down with his right hand, picked up the bloody iron spike from the floor, and slid it back into his torn canvas pocket. "Let's get to the car." They walked out of the tower and back down into the dark tunnels together, their boots leaving twin sets of gray tracks in the ash on the stairs, while behind them, the empty city of Scranton began to wake up in the freezing rain.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share.